Finally, a ceasefire deal has been struck between Hamas and Israeli terrorists. This was announced by Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani. As part of the deal, Israel will partially withdraw from Gaza and humanitarian efforts will surge. This was confirmed by genocidal Joe Biden as he took the podium at the White House to take credit for this deal, even though it's clear that it was Donald Trump whose chilling warning that all hell will break loose if a ceasefire deal wasn't achieved by the 20th of January ultimately forced Israeli terrorists to agree for the ceasefire. That's a fact.
The elements of this deal were what I laid out in detail this past May, which was embraced by countries around the world and endorsed overwhelmingly by the UN Security Council.
I'll come back to this in a bit, but let's look at the finer points of this deal. Under the ceasefire deal, reached only a few hours ago, 33 Israeli hostages, including women, children, and civilians over the age of 50, taken during the Hamas-led attack on southern Israel on 7th of October 2023, will be released. In exchange, Israel will release a large number of Palestinian hostages during this phase, including those hostages currently serving life sentence given to them by Israel's kangaroo courts. Among the Palestinians being released are around 1,000 who were taken hostage by Israel after 7th of October. Israel will then withdraw its forces from Gaza's population centers to areas no more than 700 meters inside Gaza's border with Israel. However, that may exclude the Netzarim corridor, the militarized belt bisecting the Gaza Strip and controlling movement along it. The withdrawal by Israelis from here is expected to take place in multiple stages. Israel will also allow civilians to return to their homes in North Gaza, where Israeli terrorists had held thousands of Palestinians captives for months, prompting aid agencies to warn that famine may already have taken place. And we all have seen how people have been dying due to starvation there, because Israelis, with the support of the US and the UK and their Western allies, have been blocking the supply of aid into that part of Gaza. But under the deal, Israeli terrorists will allow a surge of aid into Gaza, up to 600 trucks per day. Israel will also allow wounded Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip for treatment and open the Rafah crossing with Egypt 7 days after the start of the implementation of the first phase. Remember, this Rafah crossing was taken over by Israelis when they launched their Rafah operation last year. Americans have said that they were not in favor of Rafah operation, but they turned a blind eye when Israelis began to cause carnage in that part of Gaza. So this is why I say that when Joe Biden says that he has been responsible for striking this deal, he's lying. And I'll come back to that point in a bit. Let's continue with the final points of this deal. Israeli forces will reduce their presence in the Philadelphia corridor, the border area between Egypt and Gaza, and then withdraw completely no later than the 50th day after the deal comes into effect. As expected, both Biden and State Department's Zionist spokesperson Matthew Miller wasted no time in claiming credit for this deal. However, when they were asked by reporters about Donald Trump's role, neither of them had any satisfactory answers. They could have simply said that no, Donald Trump was not responsible or his transition team was not responsible. But they didn't have the courage or guts to say that, because they would have been exposed.
How much credit do you give to the Trump team for this deal? Trump's already taking credit for it.
Well, this is the exact framework of the deal I proposed back in May. Exact. And we got the world to endorse it. Secondly, it's America's support for Israel that helped them badly weaken Hamas and its backers and create the conditions for this deal. And thirdly, I knew this deal would have to be implemented by the next team, so I told my team to coordinate closely with the incoming team to make sure we're all speaking with the same voice.
There's a lot of discussion about who actually got this deal over the line. Was it this administration, or was it the presence of people from the incoming administration that was able to do it? I recognize that you guys have pretty much welcomed the Trump administration's involvement in this. Why?
Let me say a few things first before I get to the specific question of why we have welcomed their support. The first is that this ceasefire agreement is an agreement that was conceived of by this administration, that this administration traveled the world to garner support for, and that members from Secretary Blinken on down put their credibility behind. There are a number of things I think that went into getting here today, but if you look at the most important, or let me give you two really important factors before I get to the question about President-elect Trump's involvement. I think the most important factor was that after the president laid out this proposal publicly at the end of May, Secretary Blinken and other members of the United States government went around the world generating support for this proposal, and won the endorsement of not just countries in Europe, but countries across the Middle East, Arab and Muslim countries across the Middle East that said they supported this proposal. It won the endorsement of the United Nations Security Council. And what that did is it left Hamas isolated and alone. And I can tell you that we began to see a weakening of Hamas's position after that diplomatic campaign that we executed. The other thing that I think was critical to getting us here today is Hamas finally realized that the broader regional war that they had been hoping to achieve since October 7th, the broader regional war that was part of their original strategic effort, that they weren't going to get that their allies in Hezbollah were weakened and decimated, that Iran was not going to come to their aid, was not going to launch a full regional war, and that was to some extent because of the work that the United States did to prevent that from happening. And that the fall of Syria showed that one of their last allies was, fall of the Syrian regime, I should say, that one of their last allies was erased from the map. So I think you add those things together, you had in Hamas, first, a terrorist organization that was isolated, and then it eventually left realizing that it really had no choice but to accept a ceasefire because the strategic goal that they wanted to achieve for so long just wasn't going to happen. Now, when it comes to the involvement of President-elect Trump's team, it has been absolutely critical in getting this deal over the line. And it's been critical because, obviously, as I stand here today, this administration's term in office will expire in 5 days. And one of the things that we have always said about this deal is that when you get from stage 1 to stage 2, that the United States, Egypt, and Qatar are the guarantors of this deal. And Egypt and Qatar will push Hamas to stay at the bargaining table and to get from stage 1 to stage 2, and the United States will push Israel to stay at the bargaining table to get from phase 1 and phase 2. So obviously those are promises we cannot make on behalf of the United States for any longer than the next 5 days. And so it's critical that all of the parties to the agreement and the other mediators see that when the United States is in the room making commitments, those are lasting commitments that extend beyond this administration into the next one. I will just say, lastly, I don't know if it's unprecedented to have envoys from an outgoing and an incoming administration sitting at the same table negotiating a ceasefire agreement of this kind. But if it's not unprecedented, it's certainly unusual. And We, of course, thank the Trump team for working with on this ceasefire agreement. We think it's important that they were at the table. And I think it shows that when Americans are willing to work together across partisan lines, as we were willing to do on this occasion, because it's in the national interest of the United States, there's a lot that we can get done.
The fact is that war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu never wanted this deal. He's been warned by his fellow war criminals Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich that they may withdraw their support to the coalition government if a ceasefire deal was ever reached. This was Israeli newspaper reporting on Ben-Gvir's confession and warning only yesterday. Once again, only yesterday, war criminal Antony Blinken was fooling his audience that Hamas and not Israeli terrorists were opposing the deal. This despite the fact that Hamas had announced several days ago that they had agreed for this deal and will release 33 Israeli hostages.
What we've done over the last weeks, and especially over the last days, has put it right there. And the deal is there. It's ready to be fully and finally accepted. It's ready to be implemented. But right now, we've got to wait to get a final word from Hamas.
Even the BBC said that Israel and not Hamas were opposed to the deal.
Is that Benjamin Netanyahu has a coalition, he's got the numbers in his coalition to stay in power, and that is because of people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and another far-right leader called Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, and as long as he has their support, he can stay in power. They can't do anything to get rid of him, and that support really is dependent upon the continuation of the war. Those two in particular have essentially said that any sort of compromise, any sort of ceasefire, and they would risk bringing down the government, and that's why many people here say Benjamin Netanyahu has a vested interest in continuing the war, continuing the conflict in Gaza and in Lebanon.
This is what Ehud Olmert, former Israeli Prime Minister, said in July last year when he blamed Netanyahu for dragging his feet and opposing the deal.
And we have no illusions about Hamas, but there is a framework which has been agreed.
And on that, sorry to cut across you, on that, do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is deliberately dragging his feet on actually agreeing that ceasefire and hostage deal?
Yes. And the reason is very obvious. The partners of the coalition, the Messianic groups, on which he depends completely, made it clear that if he will make the deal, they will break down the government.
Biden and Blinken and their minions would like to convince you that this deal is exactly the same that genocidal Joe had announced on 31st of May. But Hamas had readily accepted that deal. So why did they allow the continuous destruction of Gaza and butchering of innocent Palestinian men, women, children and babies if they had so much of clout over Israel? The fact is that Biden and his administration never wanted the genocide to stop. They enjoyed the sight of Palestinian babies being vaporized by US-supplied bombs. Zionist Blinken traveled to Israel on more than a dozen occasions to join the Israeli celebration on the genocide of Palestinians. Both Biden and Blinken were repeatedly asked why they were not using the leverage to arm twist Israel so that this carnage can stop. And each time they evaded this question by blaming Hamas. They knew that there was nobody for Hamas who could deny their allegations. Had it not been for the restraint shown by Iran, Israelis and their Western allies in the US and the UK had done everything in their capacity to turn this conflict into a full-blown regional war. Just imagine Iran dropping ballistic missiles into Israel's civilian population when the rogue regime of the settler colony violated Iran's sovereignty to attack its embassy in Damascus and then kill Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. They would have been perfectly well within their rights to launch retaliatory strikes. But they didn't do. They did, but only targeted the military areas. Even a layperson in Israel will tell you that Netanyahu and his fellow terrorists were taken aback by Trump's all hell will break loose remarks. Their first impression was that this warning was meant for Hamas, but soon they realized that this equally applied to them. This is Ariel Siegel, a well-known, staunch Netanyahu supporter. expressing his disappointment with Donald Trump, claiming that they didn't expect to pay the first price of Trump's election.
טראמפ נבחר, אמרתי כאן שהראשונים לשלם את מחיר הבחירה שלו יהיו האוקראינים, טעיתי. יכול להיות שמי שמשלמים ראשונים את מחיר הבחירה של טראמפ זה אנחנו. כי הוא בעצם העסקה הזאת, אני לא רוצה להגיד, ננסים להיכנס לתוכה, לא להשתמש במילים, וגם אני לא יודע את כל הפרטים, ולכן אני אהיה יותר זהיר וכולי, אבל אני לא חושב שזה מה שאנחנו תכננו וזה מה שציפינו. חשבנו את דברים אחרים, חשבנו שנשתלט על צפון הרצועה, יאפשרו לנו למנוע הכנסת סיוע הומניטרי לאזורים האלה, וככה נפעיל לחץ על החמאס. מה שקורה, וצריך להגיד את האמת לצופים, אם מיליון עזתים חוזרים בצפון הרצועה, צה"ל לא יחזור להילחם בצפון הרצועה. אתה לא תעשה את כל האירוע הזה מחדש, להוציא מיליון איש משם. זה לא יקרה. צריך להגיד את האמת. יכול להיות שישארו בחלקים, בפרימטר, בפילדלפי וכו'. אבל מיליון איש שחוזרים מצפון הרצועה, מסיים את הסיפור. ועוד דבר, בזה המשפחות החטופים כנראה צודקות. הנשק האסטרטגי של החמאס זה החטופים. הם לתמיד ישירו בידיהם קלפי מיקוח לעתיד. זה יהיה חלק מהדרך שלהם לבטח את שלטונם. וזה מה שיקרה, ואנחנו נראה מול העיניים. עכשיו עוד דבר, בהקשר...
Let there be absolutely no doubt that war criminals Biden, Blinken, and their cronies in the outgoing administration never wanted this deal to happen. They did everything in their capacity to help Israel to carry out the genocide of Palestinians with impunity. This brain-dead president even allocated $8 billion more to Israel so that Israelis can continue to kill Palestinian babies even after he is gone. That said, I want to remain cautious on Trump's stand on the Palestinian issue, despite knowing that many of his supporters hate Israel. Let's celebrate the fact that there has been a 6-week pause in the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. Let's also celebrate the fact that the US has finally agreed to allow the food and medicine to enter Gaza. Finally, the remaining population of Gaza can see some rays of hope. I will keep you posted on these rapidly changing developments. Please keep visiting this channel and keep sharing our content. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.